Alright guys, Bill, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with part 3 of my ranking of every Australian Survivor player, where we are about halfway through the list, where we're finally at the top 100, and we're still at some not great players, but either way, let's just jump right back into it. At number 100, we're moving on to a player that I actually can't believe this person made the top 100. I was not expecting this person to make the top 100. However, they barely did. At number 100, I have Juicy Dave from Blood vs. Water. And Dave is a player that I think initially was awful. I mean, right away, he was on the outsides of his tribe. He was about to be taken out as his first tribal until he played an idol. So again, that's obviously very bad. However, I do think after that, he does recover fairly well. I mean, he does find allies and like Amy and Jay Bruno. And while they end up being targeted fairly soon, again, somehow he avoids being targeted there. And following that, he ends up getting in with the likes of Josh and Mark and ends up really staying in the majority for a good chunk of the game. Now, I do think he's someone that kind of fails to make a move along the way and probably should have. However, I do think he at least had that gusto at the tail end to recognize what he should be doing and tries to make a move against Mark and Josh, though ends up failing in doing so. But again, I think there's at least that awareness towards the end of what he should be doing, to where obviously he waited a bit too long, but ultimately, again, he at least eventually tried to make the move. So again, because I'm as good enough to be here in the top 100. Now, number 99, we're moving on to a grouping of players that have very rocky trajectories, though I think there's some potential in them as players, despite being fairly early merge boots. But at number 99, I'm going to be starting this all off with Annalise from AU 2017. And Annalise is someone that I think demonstrates some potential in the game. I mean, she is someone that is a fan of the show. She, at a point at least, was right in the middle between two sides. For a while, she was initially on the bottom after the Amy vote. I did think she did some decent work to get into that opposing alliance. The problem is that obviously she tries to make a move there. I at least respect the fact that she, again, realizes she's on the bottom, she should be doing something, but obviously it was a move that doesn't fall through, ends up backfiring on her to where she ultimately ends up getting saved by Nonalim. Even though, to be fair, she also gets kind of screwed by Nonalim, as if it wasn't for Nonalim, she wouldn't have been voted up back to back with Tara. But of that swap, I do feel like she ends up playing a lot better, becoming a major swing vote during the Jackie and Kent votes, then immediately following that ends up still remaining in the majority after the second swap. And while, again, we do get to the merge, where she's eventually blindsided when Jared goes home and is on the bottom again, she does get taken out in a pretty wonky spot where she does realize that she needs to play her idol, does so only for it to be nullified by Ziggy, which again is unlucky for her that idol nullifiers in the game, to where, again, in most given season, she'd be surviving that round. So I do think there's that like level of potential there for Annalise. She definitely has some natural good instincts for the game. And at points, I do think she was playing the middle fairly well. Though ultimately, again, it's still a game where she does end up on the bottom multiple times. Though again, in comparison to the last few people we talked about, I do think there's probably more natural potential there from Annalise than them. So again, I'm going to have her here number 99. And number 98, essentially the same thing, but also I think was actually able to demonstrate a lot more power in the game, other points in the game. And that person is Eileen from Titans vs. Rebels. And Eileen's a player that, kind of like Annalise, gets saved by a twist, though obviously she was swap screwed to begin with to be in that position. Though still, again, that Charles Tribal was obviously just very wonky, where in most given situations, she doesn't really even make the merge in that spot, though again, by some miracle, she's able to get through that tribal. Now, all in all, though, I do think Eileen is a confident player here, where we see her essentially be the right-hand man to Ferris and really end up helping him make decisions at many points in that middle portion of the game. And even then, I feel like there are points where she had incorrect reads on the game, at points where Ferris didn't, like during that Garrick vote, to where, again, I think Eileen is a player that comes off as a very safe, sound, strategic player, though I think a major issue comes from the fact that she didn't really have much of a path in the game following the point she was taken out, where, again, she's taken on the early merge, where obviously Kirby flips the vote onto her, though that's even a spot where Ferris wasn't really that upset by it, and even he knew that he had to be taking out Eileen at some point before the end, where Eileen, I think, is just somebody that, yes, she is very naturally gifted for the game, though is someone that is also just a very big threat from a strategic standpoint. People knew that, so I do think she would struggle to actually get to the end. But again, I think there was a lot of skill involved in what Eileen was able to do on this season. And I do have a bit more confidence in her than Annalise. So again, I have her here number 98. Now number 97, we're moving on to a player in the same spot as the last few players that we just talked about, though probably had a smoother path through the early game, and that player is Samuel from Champions vs. Contenders, and he is a bit of a strange figure here where I really didn't know what to really do with him, as he's someone that is stably within the majority for most of the game, essentially just kicked out of that majority in a spot where the likes of Matt Rogers just looks at him as untrustworthy, to where I really don't know if Sam really had much of a path through the game following that, where no one really seemed to be wanting to work with him long term. But at the same time, again, I think he demonstrated a lot of potential earlier in the game. I mean, he maneuvered through the game fairly well. He's one of the few people being involved in the Russell vote off when it happened, where again, he was just like constantly in the majority, but it never really felt like he had a long-term path in the game, to where while I do think he is a competent player that was at least able to stay in the majority, I still don't really know where his game was going. So again, I do have him here. So I do have him here at number 97. Number 96, we're moving on to a player that is probably more in line with a few players that we talked about a little bit back, like Juicy Dave, who this player ended up having a fairly similar trajectory to him, though I think there's a major difference between the two, and that player is Simon Black from Champions Contenders 2. And again, Simon's really just this player that was just on the bottom after the Athlete Alliance got flipped on very early on in the season, and though is relatively safe beyond that, especially after the swap phase, where while he would have been next to go had they not swapped, once we get to the swap, again, he's just there, not really doing that much actively, but again, it's just kind of riding along with that alliance until they get to the merge and once again have the numbers for a bit. Now, he does eventually end up attempting to make a move at the final 7, though ends up being outplayed by Abby by that point, which leads to his elimination. Though even then, again, he really was just like playing on the bottom for a lot of the season and didn't really seem to build bonds with the opposing side, where again, it really feels like Simon was just kind of there for a lot of his run. Though again, in comparison to Juicy Dave, I think their games are fairly similar, especially in terms of their overall trajectories through the game. They were kind of on the bottom of a big majority group that they kind of eventually recognized that they were on the bottom and needed to make a move on, while also having a fairly rocky start where Simon's initial alliance having been flipped on. Though I think a major difference here between him and Dave is the fact that Dave needed an idol to get through those early days, while Simon didn't and was actually just kept around over all of his allies, which I think is a lot better. But again, I at least will give him credit for trying to make a move towards the end. The problem is that, again, he just really had no social capital to do it, which is also a major issue, but again, still made it fairly deep into the season. So again, for me, that's good enough to put him here at number 96. Now, number 95, we're moving on to a player that is not that dissimilar from Simon Black either, but at least seemed to have some sort of allies towards the end, and that player is Andrew from Brains vs. Brawn. And again, I think this is actually pretty close between him and Simon, where I think Simon probably has better like natural instincts for the game, where he was willing to make a move by the end. Oh, Andrew's someone that I don't know how acclimated he really is for the game of Survivor. Well, obviously he's good at the survival aspects, but in terms of the actual strategy elements of the game, he did seem pretty stagnant. He really seemed to just be going along with his group and doing whatever he felt was morally right, which was essentially not working with George most of the time. And again, initially sticking to that Joey group, and then sticking with the Brains until obviously he turns on Haley, and then sticking to the Brawn, where really it felt like a game of him like just flip-flopping based around who he felt more connected to, or any like real strategic reason, where I'm really not sure how much gumption he really had in the game, where I don't know how intentional a lot of his game is, but I do feel like Andrew is a player that will make it deep on most given seasons, and does have the ability to win challenges towards the end. And while I do, again, struggle with the idea, like, can he actually win a modern game of Australian Survivor? But I do give him a lot of credit here for just how fluid he plays in the game. And while, again, I don't know if any of that was based around game reasons, I do feel like Andrew, in comparison to Simon Black, just felt like a more fluid player. He was more willing to turn against his alliance in spots where, again, Simon kind of just stuck to his spot in the bottom for way too long, to where, again, at least Andrew was willing to flip-flop if he felt like it was necessary, to where, again, it's not much of a difference, but for me, it's good enough to put him here at number 95. Now, number 94, moving on to a two-time player that the furthest they've gotten is the merge vote, and that player is Lydia. And Lydia's actually a pretty difficult player to rank here, as, again, I do feel like Lydia is actually someone that does have some skills for the game, where obviously she gets largely remembered as massive physical presence, and obviously she did dominate in challenges on Champions Contenders 1 in particular, though I also feel like she's a player that probably gets a bit slept on in terms of other aspects of her game on that season, where while I do think her early game was, again, a little rocky, and she's largely being kept around for physical strength, I do think once she gets to the swap, I do think I actually give her a lot of credit there for being able to pull over the likes of Benji and Robbie and game beside of her over Heath and Vanilla, where, again, I do think that was fairly impressive play, though obviously, doesn't really matter as when she gets to merge, her own alliance turns on her anyway. So again, that's not great. Though she obviously ends up returning for All-Stars in a spot where, obviously on that season, she's booted fairly early. Though again, that is a position where she ends up being pretty swap screwed. And I do think she actually had a fairly solid game on that season before that. So she was in the initial majority on her starting tribe, to where she kind of was this like second command to Abby. And while obviously Abby eventually gets blindsided after her swap, and she ends up being on the bottom right after that, I did think it's a spot where she got fairly unlucky in how everything played out. Where overall, again, to me, Lydia's just a player here that probably makes a deep run on most given seasons. She obviously didn't have this lack of threat management, where I think people looked at her as massive physical presence, and she was always going to struggle because of that. Though I do think she has some ability in the social and strategy aspects of the game as well, to where I just feel like she seems like a player that would be a fairly consistent one if she doesn't get swap screwed. So because that, again, I have her here at number 94. Now number 93, essentially Lydia, but better, I guess. And that player is John from Chance Presenters 2 and All-Stars. And again, John's a player here that technically does outlast Lydia on All-Stars, in a spot where, again, they were both on the same tribe. They're really both in the same position for most of that season. Again, being alongside Abby in this majority alliance, getting swap screwed. Though, again, it was a choice between Lydia and John, and they decided to take out Lydia. So, again, that's something for John here. And really just in general, I mean, he ends up surviving a decent amount of votes on that season. To where, again, John's really just not that bad of a player naturally. Where, again, he's just another one of these that I just don't know how intentional his game is. Where I actually feel like I saw more strategic insight from him on his short stint on the Challenge Australia than I ever saw him on Australian Survivor, where maybe if he were to come back nowadays, he'd be a more cutthroat player and have more strategic elements of the game. Though, realistically, again, his game's one where he's just kind of riding with the majority. It happened the first time as well, and is also taken out in a weird spot there, where it's like weird tide vote, to where, like, really, John's resume is just, again, kind of fine. Just, again, 2 okay appearances, just not particularly strategic appearances. And at the end of the day, again, I just think he's a step above Lydia. He's here at number 93. Now, number 92, moving on to a player that I don't think is particularly good, but they're a pretty stable player that made it very deep, and that player is Commando Steve from Champions vs. Contenders. And again, Steve is just another player that just rode with the majority the entire time he was there, where, again, after Matt Rogers gets taken out, he's just kind of on the bottom. Now he does survive over Benji, but again, he clearly was just a dead man walking, I guess in more ways than one, considering he was literally part of the dead man walking twist. But again, beyond that, there's not really much to say about his game. He just rode alongside Matt for most of the season. He doesn't really seem to do much of the legwork for his group. He was just kind of there, kind of just stably in the majority, where, again, I think in many ways he's very similar to John, where, again, he's just going to stay in his group, and the entire basis on how well he does on the season really just relies on, does his majority stay in the majority or not, which, again, has nothing to do with what he's actively doing. Where I think there should be some minor credit here in the fact that he survives over Benji at least. But again, Steve's just a player, ultimately, I don't look at too highly, but he's just a player that will probably make it deep most given seasons. He at least was this, like, second command figure to Matt Rogers, so at least that's something. But again, it's not like he's actively good, but again, he's not actively bad either. So again, he's good enough to be here at number 92. Now, number 91, we're moving on to kind of a weird player on this list, another one that was fairly difficult to place, because I do feel like there's a lot of weird circumstances around their elimination. I'm going to go with Petey from Brains vs. Brawn 2, and Petey's a player that obviously didn't get much of an edit on his season, yet from what we've heard post-show, it did actually seem like he was a pretty integral player in the game, one that was actually kind of in the middle of the game for a decent chunk of it, where on the show, he was kind of portrayed as like this kind of loyal soldier for the Brawn, when the reality is that it seemed like he was actually someone that was very much willing to flip on them, especially in the post-swap phase of the game, potentially work with the Brains. And that spot, though, because Max ends up flipping right away, it didn't really give him the opportunity to flip himself. Now, technically, he does start the game in the minority, where he's not really in that group with, like, Jesse, Ben, Noonan, and Polly. Yet, he is not really in any particular danger either, where he seemed to be fairly safe, fairly well-liked, seemed to be working alongside Zen and Kristen, and despite not being in the majority, not really being in a bad position in the game either. Again, supposedly he was close to making a move post-swap, though wasn't really given the opportunity to do so because of Max flipping, and though despite that still was able to make it to emerge, and at that point seemed to be gaining some potential in the game. He rejoined with Kristen. He was kind of in a middle position at that point, though obviously he ends up getting eventually sniped out of the game. And to be fair, again, Laura wanted to target him. Obviously Miles wanted to target him. it's not like he's flawless in that position, but still spot where again he gets out of the game from an idol that was stolen from his number one ally. Again, it definitely is a pretty screwy situation to where all things considered, it does sound like PD was a pretty good player, just one that did not make much of the edit of the show, but one that I do think plays a solid enough game here to be here number 91. Now number 90, we're on to another player that was idled out of the game, that this one probably more stably in a majority group throughout more of the season. That player is Kez from Brains vs. Brawn. And Kez is a player that, again, was out of the game at the merge in a weird situation where technically the numbers were there to take her out if they really wanted to be, though. Again, she does technically get idled out by Haley in that spot. Though, again, outside that, Kez was really in the majority for the entire season. I mean, she was in the majority from the early game alongside Shannon and Flick. And while there's obviously the rockiness at the Benny elimination, she still was in a group with a lot of influence at that point in the game, and then ends up swapping into also a fairly good position where she's in the dominant alliance there. And again, there's some rockiness there for like considering flipping to the women for whatever reason and like take out George and Kara, but obviously she doesn't end up doing it. And I think it's a spot where Kez turns out to be a fairly competent player that, again, maybe entertained some things she probably shouldn't have, but really outside that, just, again, was in the majority for a decent chunk of the season, gets kind of sniped out of the game with an idol in her pocket, to where I do look at her as just kind of a middle-of-the-road player. She's here at number 90. Now, number 89, moving on to essentially just a step above her, because it's a person that literally just survived one normal round past her, and that player is Gerald from Brains vs. Brawn. And the thing is, again, he survives over Kez when they were in similar positions in the game, both in initial majorities, swapping over into also a majority and staying within the majority until the post-merge where, again, he survives over Kez. And following that, there's, again, a few rounds of weirdness, though the next real normal elimination is one where Gerald ends up going home. So again, I think their games are just fairly similar. There's not really that much of a difference between the two. I think actually you can maybe give Kez more credit for being more part of the core of that group with like Flick and Shannon early on, though ultimately, again, I just think they're fairly similar players, with him just kind of being a stagnant player, stayed with his group and kind of went down with the ship by the end. But again, good enough to be here at number 89. At number 88, we're moving on to a couple screwed over players in the game. This person being swap screwed, along with also having a massive reputation coming in the season. That player is Sandra Diaz Twine from Blood vs. Water. And again, this is just an assessment of her Australian Survivor game, where all in all, I think Sandra plays a fine game on this season, where obviously coming in, she had a massive target on her back, and she realistically had no real path to the end, though despite that, I don't think she plays poorly here. I mean, she really just comes in with this massive reputation, and to be fair, I do think it kind of helps her to a degree at points where people do want to keep her around for her game knowledge and also look at her as a bit of a shield in front of them. But still, she was able to keep the votes off her during like the Juicy Dave situation. She was able to be involved in taking out Sophie and also is involved in flipping the votes onto Amy and Jay Bruno, which I think is pretty good. And following that, she obviously just gets swap screwed and it's just on the bottom and has no real way to save herself. Where, again, there's not much that Sandra does actively wrong here. She just gets swap screwed, to where actually had no long-term prospects on this season, but obviously, again, that was because of this massive reputation on her back, to where, I mean, ultimately, again, she's this high because there's not really much to criticize from her run, but there's not too much to praise outside the fact that it's a surprise that she made it as far as she did. But again, it's good enough to be her number 88. Now, number 87, moving on to probably one of the most screw-over players in Australian Survivor history, really someone that just got completely sniped out of the game, and that player is Charles from Titans vs. Rebels. And Charles is a player that, again, seemed to be pretty well positioned for a good chunk of the game. I mean, the early portions of the game, he was seemingly with the majority, to where, I mean, the show doesn't really focus at all really on where exactly he was within that group. Again, he was with them, now not within the middle-age mafia, though he never felt like he was in any particular danger, though we do get this swap where he is very much swap screwed, again, being on the bottom alongside the other Titans, though is able to make the most of that. Obviously, playing off these two sides, ending up siding with the Kirby side of things, and just in general being these major swing votes for his upcoming rounds, though beyond that, Charles did seem to be really poised to have a lot of control coming into the merge phase of the game, pretty much having connections to everyone outside of that Ferris grouping. That is until, again, he gets sniped out of the game because of a twist where he gets extremely unlucky in the fact that he gets taken out when he does. Now, obviously, yes, he did play poorly to antagonize Ferris and Eileen. But really outside that, again, Charles should have been someone that should be very well positioned to get through that round, where had that been a full-blown tribal, he has no real chance of getting taken out in that spot. However, he just gets kind of sniped out here due to the twist that happened last second that saved Ferris and Eileen and gave them pretty much the soul votes to eliminate, where, again, it is a pretty screwy situation where I don't think Charles does that much wrong. He did seem to have some pretty major prospects for down the road. So again, I do think he's good enough to be here at number 87. Now number 86. Moving on to a player that I'm kind of surprised is this high, as I never looked at him as that good of a player. The more I thought about it, though, I felt like he was, again, competent enough to be this high, and that player is Winner from Times for Rebels. And Winner's a player that, yeah, he had his faults. There were definitely points where he came off as pretty dumb, and he obviously was blindsided when Charles goes home, though, obviously, again, that was a very screwy situation, but it's still a spot where he eventually does get to the merge in a decent position initially, only then be kind of screwed of Scott quitting the game, where that obviously stops the first vote from occurring, where Kitty would have gone home, and that eventually culminates in the votes flipping against Winner the next round, where I think he gets kind of unlucky in how that plays out. Beyond that, I also do feel like he was able to play the game fairly well early on, where despite the fact that his closest allies were blindsided by the Frankie vote, he was someone that was actually kind of connected to really all sides, to where he obviously had Jaden in his pocket, but he also had connections to like some Mark and Valeria, to where he was fairly safe in the game, like had a pretty solid alliance by the time he left, to where one of a flawless player. I do think Winner came off as a fairly competent one by the end, and obviously again survives over Charles in a spot where it could have been him going out in that spot. So again, I felt like it was good enough to put him above Charles here at number 86. Now number 85. We're moving on to kind of a string of players here from the same season. I think got very unlucky at how the swap played out and just came to merge down in numbers. Also, all of it coming off as somewhat competent players. We're starting it off with Connor from AU 2016. And Connor's a player here that really came into the merge down in numbers and was just kind of screwed by the time of the merge. Now, in comparison to the next few people we talk about, I think he did a bit more wrong early on in the game, where obviously he had some of these connections to the people that took him out at the merge, though ends up making those connections very rocky, to where he kind of blows up a lot of his connections with the Snapu tribe, especially with the likes of Flick and Brooke, which leads to them having this vendetta against him that makes him the merge boot, where while I do think he repairs his game fairly decently following that, it's again a spot where he's swapped into a group that just goes to tribal over and over and over again. Ultimately, again, I do think it's actually pretty impressive that he was able to survive as many tribals as he was, though ultimately he was still fairly aloof at a couple points in the game. Obviously, it was almost voted out of his Snapu tribe as well, to where again, it's not a perfect game here, though I think in comparison to many of the people we've talked about so far, I think he's someone that does have a long longevity in the game most times. He's someone that did build some pretty strong one-on-one bonds. So again, I think he's good enough to be here at number 85. Now, number 84, essentially the same game for the most part, though again, slightly better at points. That player is Kate from AU 2016. And Kate is, again, another similar case here where her and Connor really play most of the game alongside each other in the post-swap tribe, where they obviously go to a lot of tribals together. They both survive through that entire tribe, though Kate was a bit more in the majority during that portion of the game. She was involved in taking out Andrew, where Connor was blindsided by that vote. Also, she ends up surviving over Connor, so that's another plus in her direction. Now, also like Connor, though, her game does start off a little bit rocky, where she's initially blindsided when Nick goes home, and it wasn't even seeming like a spot where she was that close to Nick. So again, it really just felt like a spot where she was blindsided for the sake of it. Though again, she recovers fairly well, and again, I think she ultimately ends up being a decent enough player, decent enough socially, pretty good physically. Though I didn't love the moral high ground that she was on throughout a lot of the game, to where she was really spending the back portion of her game talking about the people that like deserve to win, and people like Nick don't deserve it, which again was kind of frustrating to see, though. Obviously, she just comes to the merge where she has no real chance to survive there. It's kind of just a no-brainer to vote her out on the spot. And even then, she actually comes closer to staying than what she probably should have, to where I do think she's a competent player. And again, good enough to be here at 84. Now, number 83, we're moving on to another player from AU 2016, and that player is Sue. And Sue's a bit of a difficult player to rank here. She's someone that is obviously of an archetype that you would not expect to do well in Australian Survivor. Again, this older woman archetype that typically is voted out early on in the season, though something impressive about Sue is the fact that she wasn't even really considered to be voted out early on in the season. And again, there was never really a point where people actually really wanted to take Sue out of the game. And to be fair, I mean, she obviously had someone like Barry that kind of took that load off her, but she was someone that seemed to be doing really well socially. People just generally liked her and wanted to keep her around, where again, even in their post-swap tribe where they lose over and over and over again, they somehow never really take a shot at taking out Sue as a physical liability, to where, again, I think that's fairly impressive, all things considered. Now, also, again, she ends up obviously surviving over Kate and Connor for actually a decent amount of rounds after that, against surviving over Nick and Kylie. Even the boot that she ends up eventually going home, that was a spot where Jenna Louise was supposed to be booted over her. And even then, it was like a very close vote, and she was mostly taken out just due to her connection to Jenna Louise. And obviously, she ends up making her big move, which surely happened. But ultimately, again, I think Sue ends up being a fairly competent player here. One that, again, for her archetype, ends up playing a pretty strong game here. One where it's kind of surprising she made it as far as she did, considering how many times she went to tribal. So again, I have her here at number 83. Now, number 82, we're moving on to a player that is a multi-time player that also has been pretty bad in most of his appearances, though there's at least some potential there to have him here at number 82. And at 82, I do have Simon. And obviously, this is a weird spot where I am making this video before Australian Survivor Redemption ends up airing, to where we know he's obviously going to be on that, to where at this current point, I do think Simon's just a player that clearly has some skills for the game, and obviously has made it deep through at least a season. Here's the Villains, though, in a spot where he made it deep largely just due to complete luck. While he does seem to win a jury vote if he got into the end, his path there was obviously very, very rocky, where when looking at his game from an overhead view, both his games are just not particularly good. I mean, his first one's one where he's in and out of the majority constantly and eventually gets taken out by his own allies flipping against him when he has 2 idols in his pocket. His second time around, he's a scrappy underdog figure and needs to win challenges to get through the game. But again, he should have been booted in episode 7 had it not been for that surprise immunity challenge. And even beyond that, he is in a spot where he kind of needs to win out at points, and spots where he's kind of on the outs of what's really going on, to where, again, on paper, he plays 2 pretty bad games. But I think the thing about Simon is that he clearly just has some potential for the game. I mean, he's clearly a big fan of this show. He knows the show fairly well. And I actually do think he is fairly decent strategically. I think the thing about Simon is that when we see him attempting to make strategic moves, I think he is, for the most part, attempting to make the correct call. The problem is that he doesn't really have the social capital to end up doing some of these moves, or some of these moves are so see-through that others are able to just counter it, to where, again, like, he's very ineffective in making these moves happen, yet I do think the moves that he's trying to make are, for the most part, optimal in most given situations. So, again, I just do not think he's the worst strategic player in the world. He's just a largely ineffective one. And when you add in the fact that he can definitely win challenges, I think he can come off as fairly endearing, to where, again, I think he can win a jury vote if he gets to the end. I think there's a lot of upside here for Simon, to where, while, again, his games are pretty bad on paper, I think the skills are there. So, again, I'm going to have him here at number 82. Now, number 81, we're moving on to a player that I think you can make a serious argument this player is actually worse than Simon, though unlike Simon, this person at least had a decent amount of control at a point in one of their games, and that player is Henry from AE 2017 and All-Stars. And again, the reality is, like, Simon is maybe a player that I would have more faith in than Henry if they were to return. Yeah, Henry is still a player here that really dominated his initial tribe, and really that's kind of on AE 2017. That's kind of the reason why he's above Simon here, is because he at least did have a decent amount of leverage at that point in the game. To obviously sabotaged himself by swapping over to the other tribe by choice. He still does, again, have a lot of power in, like, the Joan vote, keeping the votes onto her, leads the charge against Sam and Mark, and obviously he makes an astronomically dumb move by swapping over for no reason. But even in that spot, I mean, he was a dead man walking initially, but he does end up making some inroads by the time they go to tribal, to where he ends up surviving over Ben. And even then, the options are more so Ben or Michelle more so than him. So even then, he's able to, like, build a really strong bond with Lockie. And, like, coming into the merge, he ends up being in the majority once again, though obviously eventually gets blindsided with an idol in his pocket. But again, his game on that season is not entirely bad. But then again, we get to All-Stars, which is pretty horrible, though, where All-Stars is really just him doing the worst thing for his game at almost every opportunity. Again, just him just kind of seemingly wanting to make a move for the sake of making a move, pushing allies away, and again, just ends up being a very terrible run there. Though, again, I think the upsides are still there for Henry from what we saw in his first appearance. I do think he definitely has some skills for the game, and at least had some power in the game, unlike Simon, where while I do think he's a very sloppy player, I do think the upsides to him are good enough to put him here at number 81. Now, number 80, we're moving on to a player that I actually wanted to put higher here. And this is a player that, again, I do see a lot of potential in. Though at the end of the day, I just feel like the resume is just not there. And at number 80, I'm going with Nick Iadanza. And Nick is someone that, again, generally I think has a lot of skills for the game, but straight up, if we're just taking his first appearance into account, he would be fairly low on this list. He's not a particularly good player the first time around. Mind you, obviously, it wasn't a cast that was particularly well situated for him, but he was in a spot where he's instantly blindsided from his original tribe. Again, would have been the 5th boot of his season, but then gets saved by a Nanalim. And once that happens, he's once again just on the bottom. Yeah, he's able to scrape on through, build enough connections with the likes of Flick and Brooke and Matt to be saved over Tegan. And again, after that, he doesn't really go to tribal again until the merge, where throughout the entire phase of the game, he's not particularly well situated in the game. Like, he's not really the first target either, but he's someone that is not really trusted, and someone that's also like doing some weird things with like his relationship with Jenna Louise and just kind of burning that relationship even more, to where, again, just some bad play there. And again, we get to the merge where he's really just saved by the fact that he's in the technical majority for his first couple rounds until they realize that we don't want to work with him because he's a liar and flip on him immediately, which again, not a great game the first time around. But then we get to his All-Stars appearance, which I actually think is better. I mean, despite the fact that he ends up being a pre-merge boot on that season, I think he ends up playing the early game fairly well there, kind of riding the middle a bit, to where, well, again, he kind of wasn't getting his way when like Shawnee was about to get voted out. He was fairly safe himself during that portion of the game, and coming into the swap, he does kind of get swap screwed here, again, being swapped into the bottom, away from his allies, and even then he ends up surviving a few votes there despite continuing to lose his allies. And ultimately, obviously, by the time he goes home, he doesn't really have much of a chance to save himself there. He's not really able to gain any traction in the post-swap phase. But again, I do think that was a pretty solid appearance from him, to where ultimately, again, I think he is kind of a middling player, though one that does have a lot of potential, to where if he were to play again, I think I would have a decent amount of faith in him. But I think his track record is just way too spotty to put him much higher on this list. So again, I have him here at number 80. Now, number 79, we're moving on to a stretch of players here that were kind of goats in the game, not particularly respected, would have likely not won their seasons, yet I think demonstrates some game ability along the way. And at 79, we're starting it off with Shay from Blood vs. Water, who obviously was a runner-up there, got no votes at the end. Yeah, I think Shay, again, is just a player here that probably goes deep on most given seasons. She's a very physical presence, can win a lot of challenges, seems to be fairly affable socially. I think a major downside for her is that she's not particularly active strategically. But even then, like, even on this season, like, she ends up being kind of screwed over by, like, Nina getting medevac, who was obviously someone that was her closest ally at that point in the game. Obviously loses Brianna early on in the game, and then she loses Ben before the merge, and really despite that, is still able to make it fairly deep into the game, where she did at least initially have this relationship with Josh, and while ultimately she ends up getting into the merge in a spot where she's on the bottom, and eventually gets taken out by that Broy alliance, and ends up later returning to the game. And I don't know if there was that much she could really do on this season, where we obviously had all these incentives for likes of Josh and Mark to be working together. But again, she ends up returning to the game in a spot where she's really just a goat from that point forward, gets to the end, and wins some last minute challenges, though again, it's just not a great game here. But in the grand scheme of things, again, she's just someone that was on the bottom and didn't really get much of her way throughout the season. But I do feel like she's the type of player that is naturally skilled to make it deep into the game more times than not, to where I don't know if that strategic agency is necessarily there to really pull off a winning game, but I do think she can at least make it to the end a lot of times. And again, for me, that's enough to put her here at number 79. Now, number 78, similar thing, though, but again, for someone that I think is a slightly better player, particularly due to this person probably having a little bit more going on in the strategic aspects of the game, and that player is KJ from Blood vs. Water. And again, similar thing, KJ's also eliminated, comes back through Purgatory, though, to be fair, I actually feel like she gets kind of screwed over to be voted out to go to Purgatory to begin with, where it's a elimination, it happens back to back. Well, she wasn't really given much time to save herself, but again, like Shay, she comes back being looked at as a GOAT. Now, again, I think there's an argument that Shay is a better player, and says that I think Shay is someone that probably more consistently makes it deep in the game. I think KJ definitely has the potential to be an earlier boot here and there, but I also feel like KJ just seemed to be a more strategically sound player more of the time. Now, obviously, she ends up making a pretty big mistake at the final 5, essentially voting herself out, but that's obviously just her being tricked by a player that ends up being way higher on this list, where I was like, I do feel like her game is just cleaner than Shay's, where Shay obviously gets naturally voted out during her elimination round. KJ, again, was in a more spotty situation, where who knows if she would have been voted out if they had a full round there. And to be fair, she probably would have, considering it's Blood versus Water. But really outside that, again, her game is fairly similar to Shay. I think there's an argument that Shay is probably someone better situated for Australian Survivor in particular. But from what we've seen of them, I do feel like KJ seems like the more strategic player of the two, and gets a bit more screwed than Shay does. So again, I have her here at number 78. Now, number 77, we're moving on to a player that was a pretty big goat in the game, could not win the game, and also got saved by an on a limb, but also somebody that had a bit more strategic agency than the last few people we talked about, and that player is Tara from AU 2017. And Tara's a player here that obviously made it to the final two in a spot where she did get some votes, so at least there's that. But mind you, some of those votes were really just due to Jericho bombing those questions, but still, she got some votes. And beyond that, I think Tara is someone that definitely has some natural instinct for the game. I mean, while she does get eliminated fairly early on, gets saved by Nonalim, she was still seemingly a player that was very willing to flip-flop in the game. We do see her initially working with like the Adam side of things, and then flipping over to the Loki side of things, to where obviously things fall apart there, but we also see her playing a fairly fluid end game, like turning against Loki and ultimately fighting Keep Jericho around, which again, you can question as, I don't know if she should have been doing that, but realistically, she'd lose to anybody anyway, where at least she gets to a final three or both people are taking her to the end, so at least there's that. And again, she at least didn't lay down and die in the end game there. Sure, she at least made some moves to get the outcome she wanted. Now, obviously, again, she's able to do that because she's in more of a power goat position where everyone knows that they would beat her at the end and don't want to take her out herself because of that. Though again, she still at least had some power in the game and was able to utilize that. But ultimately, I think that's something to be commended here. And again, at the end of the day, we're really just comparing her to Shay and KJ here, who I don't think really do that much on their own to really shape up the end game in their image. I feel like Tara at least does so and at least gets to the final two. The person she's trying to get to the final two with, again, saves Jericho, flips against Loki. So I think there's at least some agency there in that end game to put her here at number 77. Now number 76, and now we're moving on to players that were booted a bit earlier in the game, but definitely had more legs in the game had they survived where they were taken out. And at 76, here we're moving on to Laura from Brains of Brawn 2. And Laura's one that I do think is a bit of a frustrating player at points, where she's someone that does make some questionable decisions, really pushes a bit too hard for what she wants, that comes off as very see-through to the others, that burns her relationships with them. Though she is someone that does clearly know the game fairly well, started off playing pretty well from the offset, Ozzy being part of the Covenant Alliance, and again, seemed to be very well positioned on her original tribe. Now, again, she pushes too hard in that position and ends up pushing away her own alliance by really pushing for Rich to stay, which I do think was definitely misguided there, though it did seem like she had a lot of influence during those early rounds. And following that, she ends up getting pretty swap screwed into a pretty unfortunate situation where obviously she's on the bottom and in a spot where Max just like instantly flips over, where it really doesn't give the brains much room to maneuver, where it did seem like we were in a world where PD was willing to flip, though that kind of gets nullified by the fact that Max wasn't really sticking with them. And though, to be fair, in that spot, I think Laura plays fine. Again, just playing for self-preservation. Obviously throws Miles under the bus, only for Miles to save himself with an idol. And then we get to that weird like non-limb round where you could definitely fault Laura for telling Zara about her advantage. And that entire situation does really sever the bond between Laura and Zara moving forward. Ultimately, I do think she plays that portion of the game fairly well. I mean, she's able to turn around the votes where it did seem like her and Zara were able to flip over Kate and Morgan against Jesse, and it did seem like the votes would have landed on Jesse had they gone to tribal in that round, though again, they never do go to tribal until the post-merge, where again, she's back alongside Logan, ends up becoming a big target because of that. And to be fair, Logan was always the bigger target than her, though obviously Logan plays the idol and Laura goes home, to where, yeah, I do think it's a spot where, again, she gets unlucky that an idol ends up taking her out of the game, though it's also a spot where I don't think she plays particularly well leading up to that. But I do think she demonstrated a lot of skills as a player here. Clearly someone that was a fan of the game, and I do think if she were to play again, I think she would play better than what she did the first time around, and considering, again, even the first time around, she had a decent amount of influence and was out of the game, I think she's good enough to be here number 76. Now, number 75, we're moving on to a player that wasn't as much screwed, but more so just got kind of unlucky if her tribe being entirely pagonged along the way, and that person is Jenna Louise from AU 2016. And Jenna Louise really is a player that had some potential in the game, but just was never really given the opportunity to do much with that, where, again, she was part of the initial power structure on Vavau, alongside Craig, seemed to be running things, though gets swapped into a spot where she's on the bottom, because Nick got saved by Nonalim and pushed for her to be swapped over to screw her over. And it is fairly likely that she does go if her tribe were to ever go to tribal, especially with Nick having this massive vendetta against her. But again, they never go to tribal, and even if they did, that would be a spot where she was screwed over by the swap. But again, once we get to the merge, it really is just a spot where she does end up voting alongside the majority, but again, she's clearly down in numbers on the bottom of that group, though there's not really much she could really do anyway. And we do see her, again, at least attempting to push towards the end of her run to make a move happen. And again, it does end up going through, but she's still a player that makes it to the final 8 in a spot where she did have, again, decent amount of influence early on. And I don't think she does that much wrong to really cause her eventual elimination. It really just a spot where she just runs out of runway on a season where, again, she wasn't really given much runway to begin with once she came into the merge down in numbers, to where in reality, I think it's kind of impressive that she makes it as deep as she does, considering she was seemingly at the very bottom of that group, but again, ends up surviving over Nick and Kylie. I think she is a fairly competent player, but just a player that never really got any traction after the swap. But I think a lot of that was just fairly bad luck, and I do think she's a good enough player here to land her at number 75. Now, number 74, moving on to a similar player from 2016, and that player is Craig. Now, with Craig, there was a bit of a debate for me, as I think there's definitely an argument that Jenna Louise is a better player, especially with their games being so similar early on, where they were obviously working together early on. Though in many ways, I think Craig was looked at as the leader, and through that was a bigger target than Jenna Louise. Though that said, obviously we do have Craig going to more tribals in the pre-merge, and I think he ends up playing fairly well throughout most of them, maintaining control of his tribe. Now, I do think taking out Andrew is maybe something he shouldn't have done. That did seem kind of short-sighted. And he also could have split the vote during his boot tribal. I think that was also a misplay there, though. I think it's still a spot where he's fairly unlucky to be taken out of the game in the spot that he was. Obviously, it required Phoebe to find an idol to use against him, and even that was a spot where it felt kind of illogical that you would take a shot at someone like Craig, who's the biggest physical presence on a tribe that's losing challenges over and over again. Though again, kind of got to the point where they lost so much that you might as well just take a shot at the leader of the tribe. And really, I feel like it was like pretty much the only way that he would have actually gotten home in the pre-merge phase, as it did feel like he had a pretty big stranglehold in that grouping otherwise. Trey really just gets sniped out by Phoebe's idol. Though ultimately, I do think Craig is someone that was just kind of screwing that season no matter what, where even if he did make it to the merge, he obviously would have been probably one of the first few boots after that anyway. I don't think he had a path forward, but again, that's just simply because challenges didn't go in their favor, where I think outside that, Craig is just, again, a pretty solid player on this season, where I think Craig would have a decent chance at winning really any given season, though on the season that he was on in particular, I didn't think he was just fairly unlucky to be taken out in the spot that he was. And I think in comparison to Jenna Louise, I think, again, just demonstrated more control in the game, though obviously he was just allowed to demonstrate more control of the game through not being completely swap screwed. But considering the finickiness of him being taken out as well, again, I do have him above her, but barely, at number 74. Number 73, and now we're moving on to a couple of the better merge boots in the show's history. First, starting that off with Jared from AU 2017, and Jared's one that, I'll be honest, I did debate a bit. I did think about putting him lower at a point, though I do think with Jared, it's a spot where, again, he's a merge boot in a pretty unceremonious way, where he really just comes to merge down in numbers. So again, I do think his game up to that point is fairly strong. He's obviously alongside AK, really allowing AK to take lead in things, though also having some pretty good relationships within his grouping, never really being brought up as a target, always staying in a pretty strong position, while AK is kind of the shield for him, and following the swap is once again just stably in the majority, goes through a decent amount of tribals. Even after AK ends up being screwed out of the game, he's really able to pick up where AK left off, reorganizing AK's allies, where at that point, again, he becomes the leader figure, and that's why he's taken out of the merge. But I do think he had the right idea of how to play the game. Just, I think, got fairly unlucky how AK got swap screwed, weakening his position in the game, and also just in general coming into the merge lower in numbers. Though again, I think he demonstrated enough influence in the game to be here relatively high here at number 73. Another number 72 is a player that, again, I think you could also argue is worse than Jared. Though, again, another merge boot here that I think played a pretty solid game, and that player is David Zaharakis. And again, David's a bit of a strange figure where it did feel like he was running the game for a good chunk of the season, though despite that was barely on the show, where it did seem like he was someone that was really one of the main figures on the Heroes tribe, where despite not being a returning player, was able to really get in with those returning players, seemed to have a pretty close relationship to, again, people like Nina, people like Sam, and in the post-swap, we do see that group forming and attempting to make this blindside against Haley that gets stopped by an on a limb. Now, in comparison to Jared, I actually do think there's more actively bad play from David coming into the merge than Jared, where I would put more fault on David for some of his allies turning on him than Jared, where, again, someone like Matt is someone that he should have been able to keep in line. Haley is someone that was on his original tribe and flips. Even Simon is someone that he should have been able to keep on his side, but doesn't. To where, again, I do think he really ends up dropping the ball coming into the merge with specific people that leads to him being flipped on. To where, again, I do think David does a decent amount wrong by the time he's eliminated. So I do think there's an argument here that David should be lower, though at the same time, I do think David played a fairly strong game before that. Again, just seemed to have a lot of influence in the game. Never was in danger early on, and did so despite the other massive presences around him in the game. So again, I do think he's good enough to be here, number 72. Now, number 71, we're moving on to some mid-merge boots that demonstrates some potential in the game, but also still very flawed. At number 71, we're starting it off with Kitty from Titans vs. Rebels. And Kitty's a player that made 6th place, kind of in and out of the majority. Also made some pretty bad moves along the way, where Kitty's someone that I do struggle to see her winning the game at the end, especially against anyone but Caroline. But with that being said, I think we saw Kitty having a lot of influence in the game, where even though I do think Kitty is particularly bad at lying and had some horrible reads and makes some terrible decisions because of that, I actually do think she's in a spot where she did seem to have people wanting to work with her due to her social graces, where people just liked her, gravitated towards her, where we see Sarah and Rihanna just continuing to trust her when they really shouldn't have. Though again, it still calls back to the point that she had a terrible read on Mark and thought Mark was still with her. So the fact that Sarah and Rihanna trust her when they couldn't is really based around Kitty's own misread of Mark, but still, I think that's something to be commended with there. Though again, she still made some terrible decisions, like her flipping against the Titans for no reason, especially at the point where they finally had numbers. Her decision to just openly talk about how rich she is for no reason. Well, I do think she gets saved at the merge due to Scott quitting. I do think the fact that she at least built a bond with Scott enough to where he wanted to quit to save her is at least something also. But again, I think she ends up just being a sloppy player here, but one that definitely had some good social skills for the game. So I am going to land it here, number 71. Now, number 70, and keeping with fairly sloppy players, the players that still have a level of potential. Now we're moving on to Danny from Brains vs. Brawn. And again, I think Danny's just, again, a fairly sloppy player, one that I don't really agree with a lot of the decisions that she ends up making across the season. Danny was just kind of in and out with the majority at points. Actually, initially in the minority, and while, again, she was still fairly safe despite that, she was technically in the minority of the original Brawn tribe, gets swapped in a spot where she does win the battle against Shannon. At least there's that. She does end up picking up Haley and the Brains as numbers, though even in that position, ends up proceeding to trust them too much to where she ends up blindsiding Simon, which was a really bad move, and in doing so, ends up almost being taken out as the backup of it. But again, creates this feud of Haley that leads to very mixed results at the merge. But to fair, I mean, just the post-merger Brains vs. Brawn is just so rocky to begin with that no one is really in the majority the entire time. But again, she's someone that seemed to be one of the bigger targets coming to emerge. Does get benefit from the fact that she eventually gets the sole vote to eliminate Baden. That's definitely a thing that happened. But beyond that, again, we also see her messing up the Gerald vote, at least the Brains getting the numbers at that point. Sorry, I think she plays fairly poorly at points, kind of just giving up her own numbers. But towards the end, I do think Danny starts to play a bit better. Now, again, it's kind of too late. At that point, she's already on the bottom. But again, I think she's playing better, starts winning challenges, gains some respect, probably wins a majority vote handily if she gets there. Just, it was a pretty difficult path there. But, and again, still a lot of influence throughout portions of the game, was able to get Simon out when she wanted him to, even though I don't think that was a good move. But again, it's just a rocky game. But one that I do think there was at least some win equity there, where realistically, had she survived their boot round, she probably has a pretty clean path to the final 3 in the way that Flick did. As I think they're probably just winning similar challenges, though, again, like Flick, I think she's very unlikely to win against Haley in the final immunity challenge anyway. But still, I do think Danny is someone that has some upsides, definitely a lot of downsides of how sloppy she is. But I think the fact that she had a lot of respect by the end, plays the game very hard, but still came fairly close to a winning trajectory there, is good enough to put her here at number 70. Now number 69, another fairly similar player that is a tad more stable. That player is Morgan from Brains vs. Brawn 2. And obviously Morgan ends up also being a strange figure here, where she does demonstrate some potential very, very early on, where it did seem like she had a lot of influence during the early portions of the game. As kind of swing vote alongside Kate, was actually the person to actually pull Kate in to take out Candy. So again, I think that portion of her game is fairly impressive, to where even then, by the time of the swap, we do see her and Kate also being the main decision makers on who to take out. leading the charge against Max and eventually against Jessie, which again, I do question if she should have been taking the shot against Jessie, but still a lot of impressive play during the early portions of her game. Though in the post-merge, it did seem like she was a bit more checked out. Didn't really seem to be talking as much game. And at that point, we do see her and Kate being a massive duo that wants to be split up. Though we do see Kate building a really strong bond with AJ that kind of keeps her in the game. Now, obviously beyond that, there's also just the notion that supposedly she didn't want to be there and wasn't really playing that hard because of that. And also because that people didn't really have much respect for her in the game, and she was very unlikely to go on to win the game. But again, I do think there are points where she did have some influence in the game. I do think she was able to get Kate to turn against Candy, which is something, though again, her game just kind of crumbles towards the end. But even at that point, still has a path to the end. Again, not to the win, but again, to the end, where I think that's at least something. Again, I think she plays a fairly fluid game, but one that ends up also just being kind of a middling player once all things said and done. But again, ends up being here number 69. Number 68, moving on to a returning player that, to be fair, most of my assessment of this player comes from their first appearance, and that player is Daisy from Champs Contenders 2, and also All-Stars. Though, again, don't really take that much to account, as there's not really much to say from her on that season. Though she did find herself in the initial majority. I mean, at least there's credit for that. Though, obviously, she has this vendetta with David, and David ends up taking her out. Though even then, that's a very wonky situation, obviously, where, again, a kind of insane idol play has to be involved to take her out there. But ultimately, again, not really much to really get from her appearance there. So again, most of the assessment comes from her first appearance, which is a bit rocky, where, I mean, she was in the majority for a decent chunk of that season, so at least there's that. She was obviously working alongside Sean, was kind of his ride or die, kind of ran her original tribe, and even after the swap, though after the swap is where I do question what she was doing in the game, as she really ends up burning her old tribe mates to work with David and Luke, who probably weren't the best options in the world, but still ends up maintaining a majority there. And even when Sean ends up coming back, she ends up obviously getting back with him and still controls the upcoming vote. But I do think it's when we get to the merge that I think her game gets particularly sloppy, where at that point she's pretty gung-ho about needing Andy out, which feels like a really bad move. Now, I do get her point of view, as obviously Andy was wanting Daisy out earlier, but I mean, she's in a spot where she kind of needs him for numbers, and through this just really, and through her taking him out, it's really just completely sinking the Contenders' chances of winning this game. Though really, even despite that, she's still able to somehow crawl her way to the final 8. So I mean, that's something, I guess. And I will say, at least Daisy is a pretty self-interested player. Again, one that did play a fairly fluid game. Or again, while I don't necessarily agree with what she thought was good for her game, she at least, again, was actively playing the game. So I do have respect for how she plays the game, even though, again, she is just very sloppy. But I do think there's enough upside here to put her here at number 68. Now, number 67, moving on to another player that was inconsistent in the game, but definitely had a lot of skills for the game, and that player is Kristen from Brains vs. Brawn 2. And Kristen's a player that, again, came into the game with very little game knowledge, didn't know much about Survivor, and considering that fact, I do think she actually plays a fairly impressive game, all in all, where while she was on the bottom initially, being outside that core group, working alongside Nash, she is someone that never was really brought up as a target, which I think is fairly impressive there. Now, again, she kind of had someone like Ursula that was being targeted over her. But again, she remains fairly safe during that portion of the game. Following the swap, she's able to build pretty strong inroads, the likes of Logan and Karin, and end up being fairly safe throughout that portion of the game as well, despite, again, coming to it in a pretty bad position. She's able to skate onto the merge, where she's able to pick up PD, and it really felt like she was gaining some pretty decent standing in the game until PD obviously gets sniped out of the game due to an idle play. But even then, she's still not targeted for a while. Though, again, I think she does. Though she still ends up losing some battles here. Like when Karin goes home, she tries to save her. That ends up actually kind of blowing up in her face. She obviously tries to save Logan by the end, ends up being ineffective in doing so, and ends up backing down when she probably should have fought more to save her. So again, her endgame does kind of unravel a bit, though I think there was a lot of skill for Kristen in the game. I mean, the fact that she was somehow able to make it extremely deep in the season without being like at the top of any pecking order, yet also just being so safe is, again, just a very impressive skill there. Considering the fact that she did all that with very little game knowledge is something that, again, I think is impressive. I think she had some good instincts for the game, just wasn't able to put it all together by the end. But again, I think she played a good enough game here to be here at number 67. Now, number 66, we're moving on to some of the more screwed over players in the game, / also players that quit the game. Starting off with a quitter, and that player is Scott from Titans vs. Rebels. And again, Scott's just a very difficult player to rank here, because I think Scott actually played a fairly strong game while he was there. I think Scott actually has a genuine argument for playing the best game up to the merge, where he actually plays a fairly impressive game, considering the fact that he had a very turbulent tribe with the likes of Kirby and Ferris going after each other. He was someone that was really able to play his middle position, and while he ended up being more aligned to Kirby, he never really got the ire of Ferris and seemed to be in a position where people still just generally liked him and people wanted to work with him, where he even comes into the merge in a pretty prime position with lots of legs in the game, only for him to obviously just quit the game. Where it's a weird aspect of Scott here, where again, he's just a person that is very skilled for most aspects of the game, though didn't really seem to just have that drive for the game. And I always find it difficult to rank players like this that technically have skills to be good players, but their fundamental flaw is the fact that they just don't care enough. So I think there'll probably be more of these people in the Survivor US list. Yeah, for Australian Survivor here, I think Scott is just a major example of this, that I really didn't know what to do with him here. I think putting him around this spot, again, getting to the better players of the show, but not quite in that upper echelon yet, but still like kind of above a lot of the people that placed the same spot that he did. I think it's a good enough landing spot for him. So again, I'm putting him here at number 66. Now number 65, we're having another fairly similar player, though, again, probably have more drive to play the game, and that player is Ross from Championship Contenders 2, and Ross is obviously someone that gets really screwed over more so by production here and them being incompetent and building a challenge that caused Ross's injury. Or really outside that, Ross seemed to be in a pretty good position in the game. He seemed to be a pretty good social presence around the tribe where everyone just liked him and wanted to work with him. He obviously had a core alliance that he was a part of. Now, I do think a big question mark for Ross is his long game, where I really don't know where people were intending on taking Ross further into the game, where while people liked him, I think it was very clear that people liked him, to where I do wonder if he could have actually gotten to the end. Though, again, him being medevac in the spot that he was just felt like him just being sniped out of the game, where he was pretty well positioned before that. And because that makes it very difficult to rank him here, where, again, compared to Scott, I actually do probably have actually more confidence in Scott as a player than Ross, though Ross is someone that, again, wanted to be there and didn't want to quit the game, had more drive to play the game. So again, ultimately, I'm going with Ross above Scott here for, again, those very minute differences. So again, Ross is here at number 65. Number 64, keeping with players that were kind of screwed over in the game, though even this one's, again, a little bit rocky. But either way, we have Valeria from Titans vs. Rebels. And Valeria's this player that I think definitely demonstrated a lot of skill for the game. Definitely someone that had some pretty strong alliances early on, was playing the middle during the early portion of the game, also had connections to Mark and Viola, and they were going to make this move against Caroline before the swap. The swap obviously disrupts things. She gets swapped into a pretty bad position. Following that, obviously losing Viola to the other side and being at the bottom of the group, only for her, Winna, and Charles to, again, do some pretty good work and getting in with Kirby. Now, I will say, I do think she handles her relationship with Ferris very weirdly and kind of demeans him for no real reason. Though, again, comes to emerge, seemingly have a lot of influence, is about to get Kitty out, only for Scott to quit the game. Though really from that point on, she's just kind of in and out of the majority. And it did seem like she kind of lost some of her gumption to play the game, where I think we see a lot more of Mark doing the work to put these future votes together, with Valeria just kind of falling to the background, where, again, we see Mark do more of the work to, like, pull over Raymond. And we do see her seemingly suspecting during her elimination round, though, again, not really doing anything about it, to where I do think it is definitely a misplay there for her to not at least be attempting to split the vote, to where, again, she does end up going home in a spot where she does get eliminated due to a twist, though I do think it's actually very likely that Valeria would have just gone anyway, even without the twist. Or again, I think that's what kind of makes it difficult to rank Valeria in this spot, especially with these screwed over players, because there's an argument that Valeria wasn't really screwed over, as she was likely to go anyway. But again, this twist just made it so that she goes out in a more unique way than just through an outright majority. Though, ultimately, again, I do think there's still a lot of skills there as a player, and you can, again, at least make the argument she's a screw-over player. So again, I think it's good enough to be here at 64. Then at 63, we're moving on to a player that was also screwed by a twist. Probably one of the most screwed-over players in Australian Survivor history, though one that probably had a tad less agency than Valeria at points in the game, but still spot higher at the end. At 63, I do have Baden from Brains vs. Brawn. And Baden's a player here that I do think up to the point that he was screwed over in the game, his game was definitely a bit rockier than someone like Valeria's, where Valeria is someone that was kind of in the majority for at least most of her game. Baden's someone that initially was on the outs alongside George during earlier portions of the season, where while, again, he was safe in terms of he wasn't being targeted, he wasn't really in the in-group of that tribe, and following that, he ends up being swapped into a position where him and Haley and becoming major swing votes, but more so due to the work that Haley seemed to do, more so than Baden. Though again, he comes in and emerge in a pretty decent position, especially after the Kez vote, where at that point, George and Kara are still pretty ride or die allies with him. He has Haley. Again, it seemed like his game was on the upper trajectory until we get one of the dumbest twists in Survivor history, where Danny gets the sole vote to eliminate for some reason. To where he goes from being very safe in the game until being taken out by pretty much one of the only people that would actively take him out. So again, had this been a natural vote, I don't think there's really any way Baden goes, as again, to get a brain out, Braun would need numbers of George and Kara, which is a spot where George and Kara are not flipping against Baden, where, again, for Baden just be really sniped out of the game in this position is, again, pretty screwy. That being said, though, Baden's just a player that I think is a bit tough to gauge, where I do think there's points where he's just, again, on the outs, doesn't really reach out to people outside of his core group. And while, again, he had some pretty strong one-on-one bonds here and there, he's someone that really didn't seem to be that well insulated outside of his core group, where it did feel like the Braun contingent was just kind of very willing to cut him. Now, ultimately, I do think Baden is someone that, in comparison to Valeria, probably had a bit more long-term prospects, where Valeria obviously was already on the bottom by the time she gets taken out. Baden is someone that, again, still had George, still had Kara, still had Haley. Though, again, I just question his overall game ability, but in this spot, it doesn't really matter. I still put him decently high here at number 63. Now, number 62, kind of the same thing, but a player that at least makes it closer to the end. That player is Jordan from Blood vs. Water. And Jordan straight up ends up probably being one of the most forgettable players in Survivor history, but also a player that was very screwed over, where, again, he was Josh's cousin in a spot where they had been really running the game throughout a lot of the post-merge phase. And obviously, they had this massive bro alliance that really ran the show, or being shields for each other, and it felt like this alliance was going to stick until pretty deep in the game, until he gets massively screwed over by a twist, where players from Purgatory end up using the advantage to split up the duos and essentially make it one of Sam or Jordan that goes home, culminating in Jordan's elimination there, which again just feels like him being sniped out of the game. Now, at the end of the day, I don't know how likely Jordan was to win the game. It did feel like Josh was obviously more likely to win than him. Even against like someone like Mark, I don't think he would have stood a shot. But I think Jordan had a pretty easy path to the end of the game had he not been taken out when he was, where, while shots would eventually be taken at Josh, I do feel like Jordan was not really a primary target had he survived past Josh, to where I could definitely see Jordan just, again, stumbling his way to the end. But ultimately, I just don't think Jordan's really the greatest player on his own. Like, we did see him play as initial tribe, being kind of on the outs once, like, Sophie gets flipped on. And while, again, it was some decent work, and him not being taken out immediately after that, I do wonder how much of that was just due to physical strength. And again, I just don't know how good of a player Jordan is on his own. But again, he was taken out in a very screwy situation where the minority was essentially handed away to snipe out person of the majority, which ended up landing on Jordan here. So while I don't think that highly of him, I do think he is someone that seems to have a lot of consistency, at least. So I feel like he would make it deep on most given seasons, and with him also being screwed over as well, again, I think it's good enough to put him here at number 62. Now, number 61, and now we're starting off with a grouping of players that were pretty big goats in the game, players that were very unlikely to win the game, the players that had a level of agency to their games. And at 61, we're starting it off with someone that is a bit tough to gauge, probably being one of the biggest goats in the show's history. I think someone that would have been very difficult for him to win the game, but I actually don't think he played that horrible game all in all, and that player is Jerry from Heroes vs. Villains. And Jerry's someone that, while I do think his initial positioning in the game was very rocky, where, again, he was in a very precarious spot in his original try, that was partially due to the fact that he's the older guy that is not good at challenges. And despite that, I think he made some pretty good relationships. He made good relationships with Matt, with Sharni. When he gets swapped over to the Villains, he makes very strong bond with George, and ends up really sticking with George for the rest of the game, becoming his, like, right-hand man, where George really credits him post-show for, like, giving him a lot of advice in the game. And again, we do see him having some input on what George ends up doing, particularly, like, when Stevie goes home. We see that being, like, Jerry's idea. And I do think a lot of the reason why Matt ends up staying in particular ends up being because of Jerry, which again, I at least will give him credit there for. Now, obviously, a big issue from his entire game really comes from the fact that Jerry just really struggles to win the game, where I don't know if he really wins the game against anybody, where I don't know if there's literally a final two situation where he can win the game. And again, that's a major problem, especially considering he spent a lot of the game trying to get in George, someone that he probably likely loses to. And even outside that, his other plan was to get to the end of Matt, someone that he also very likely loses to. That being said, it shouldn't have been that hard of a sell for him to beat Matt, where I actually do think he has a pretty decent argument to beat him. It's just I have no confidence in him to actually make that argument and actually be able to pull that off, to where I just don't think he really had much respect in the game from the jurors, to where, oh no, I just look at Jerry as someone that, again, definitely had agency in the game, definitely had an agenda and got that way a decent amount of time, especially in the back portion of the game. But all in all, his game's just kind of rocky and he just had no win equity. For a while, he did get impressive. He played the game he did in a spot where he would naturally be disfavored coming into any Australian Survivor season. I do think it's overall mixed bag. So again, I'm going to leave him here at number 61. Now at number 60, moving on to a player that's also a bit of a mixed bag here, one that kind of gets sniped out of the game, and one that was, again, kind of just in and out of the majority throughout a lot of it, but also someone that I just don't know how likely she was to win the game, and that player is Fenella for Championship Contenders 1. And again, Fenella's another one of these players that was, again, the right-hand person to Shawnee. They seemingly worked in lockstep, and through that, again, I think there were actually some highs to Fenella's game, where her and Shawnee went to a lot of tribals together, and there were some ups and downs, but for the most part, I think her and Shawnee played pretty solid games on that season, navigating through fairly well. Now, I don't think they necessarily make the correct choice at every turn, where she obviously makes the decision to side with Benji and Robbie over Tegan and Heath, who did seem more loyal to them, were being honest to them, but it's a spot where I do think her and Shawnee were the best position on the original Contenders tribe. Never really have any difficulty navigating through that, though once they end up merging, they end up being down in numbers that they are still able to survive through until the Matt Rogers vote, and while they're obviously proceed to be blindsided right after that when Brian and Monica flip to take out Benji, it's still a position where she gets back in with Brian, and obviously eventually gets taken out in a very wonky situation where like Brian messes up the split vote, but it's about where Fenella's not meant to go home, and again, it's just kind of a weird game. I don't really know how to assess her, considering again, I think there's a lot of good things on paper. I just don't know how much of it was Fenella herself, and also I don't know how likely she is to win the game. Now, I think almost anybody can beat Brian at the end, but really outside that, I never really got the sense from the jury they were like particularly rooting for Fenella. But really, Fenella just ended up being a player that I just didn't know what to do with her, where I can't really dissect much of her game as being that independent. And considering and the fact that I just don't know if she would even win the game if she got to the end, and her feeling like the beta to Shawnee, for me, I did end up landing her here, number 60. Number 59, keeping with, again, GOATs to a degree, not 100% of this player, though someone that I think was still fairly unlikely to go on to win the game. We're moving on to Raymond from Titans vs. Rebels. And Raymond, again, I do think it would have been tough for Raymond to win the game, especially considering the situation that he was actively trying to get himself to, which is the final two with Ferris. Well, while Raymond did eventually make some moves to differentiate himself from Ferris, I think a major issue stems from the fact that he still was, again, planning on going to the end of Ferris in a spot where he would lose. That being said, he at least did make a move. He did flip against Jaden, took him out, did that move entirely on his own. Then obviously had the Valeria move, which again was more of a group effort. But still, again, I think there's things I can at least give him credit for. Now, realistically, the rest of his game is really just him riding alongside Ferris, which even on his own, Ferris has a lot of ups and downs where, again, there's points where Raymond's in the majority, points where he's in the minority. Again, it's just kind of a rocky game, even outside of the fact that he kind of just actively goes to the end against Ferris, someone that he knows he's going to lose against. Though, again, I think Raymond is still a fairly competent player, one that is very likable, one that, again, people at least like. Again, I don't know if it necessarily gets him jury votes against some of the bigger players. Yeah, I think it's a spot where he wasn't as big of a GOAT as some of the other people we talked about. As again, I do think he is someone that could theoretically win the game. It's just that he wasn't trying to go to the end in a winning situation. So again, I do have him here at number 59. Now, number 58, and now we're kind of at the top of this sub-tier of more background players, but this one probably playing one of the more rocky games, but also had probably the most clear-cut win equity, and that player is Wei from Brains vs. Brawn. And Wei's a player that, again, I do think there's a lot of frustrations with Wei in terms of her decision-making, the fact that she was so willing to flip against George in spots where George did want to work with her, and spots where, again, I just did not think she was making the right call for a game. To her, again, that was just very frustrating, though there are many points in the game where I do think she makes the right call for a game, like taking out Joey, working alongside Haley throughout that endgame stretch. And obviously there are points where she's in the alliance that's controlling things, so at least there's credit for that. And even in the spot where she ends up going home at the final 5, that's a very weird vote where obviously Flick was the primary target, though they thought Flick had an idol, so George and Kara put the votes on her as a safe vote, which leads to her elimination. But it's still a spot where she's not the primary target, and considering the fact that we have learned post-show that she had a lot of win equity, where if she had gotten to the end, she beats any of the brains fairly handily, I think that's something to be commended here. Now, again, I don't know how much that was necessary due to active things that she was doing. I don't know how repeatable that win equity is, but still a spot here where she did have that win equity. And I think outside that, her game is fairly similar to the likes of like a Raymond and a Fenella. Though considering she had, again, a massive amount of win equity, I think it's definitely something that boons her on this list here. So again, for me, she's here at number 58. At number 57, and now we're moving on to a new sub-tier, kind of these mid-merge boots that I think had a lot of potential, even though, again, still had sloppy games. And at number 57, we're starting it off with Tessa from AU 2017. And Tessa's a weird player because she technically got saved by an idol very early on in the game, where, I mean, she's the recipient of Tarzan playing an idol on her and taking himself out of the game. And had that not been the case, she would have just been an early boot on this season. And again, that's definitely something to take consideration here, where, yeah, I do feel like outside of that, Tessa demonstrated a lot of skill for the game, played a pretty solid game. And even the Tarzan situation is even indicative of that. The fact that she was able to build such a strong bond with Tarzan, of where he'd be willing to do that. Also, the fact that she built a strong enough relationship with Tarzan to where he kept her safe over Kate the previous round. Now, despite that, again, her game does start off rough. She's obviously with the Adam group and ends up being flipped on at the very beginning. She's able to get in with AK and Jared and Peter and Figgy. Following that, and ends up playing a pretty solid game from that point forward. But once again, at the merge, ends up being flipped on. Ends up staying on the bottom on a lease vote, though obviously ends up being a major orchestrator of the Henry vote, which ends up being very impressive, though obviously ends up being taken out in the very weird situation of the 3-2 to 2 to 2 to 2 vote. In a spot where only 3 people wanted her out, and those 3 people just somehow got their way there. Again, it took a very precise situation for her to be sniped out of the game, where the vote had to be split on people in the minority, with the minority also not voting for any of the people on the split, while also having 3 Pacific people be willing to switch their votes out of the blue. Again, it's a very niche situation here, at least they're being sniped out, where had she not been sniped out here, I think she had a decent amount of potential following that. She had a good relationship with Michelle, she had a good relationship with Peter. Obviously, they make it fairly deep in the season, and again, I think she had a lot of potential to win the game, though again, she just gets sniped out of that position, where straight up, again, I think Tessa's game is fairly strong outside of that really horrible early game stretch, and really is possibly even better than a lot of the players we're about to be talking about. Yeah, I do think it is that early faux pas that and puts her below the next players that we're going to be talking about, to where, again, I think you definitely argue that Tessa's a better player than them. Yeah, I think when she was supposed to technically be such an early boot, I think that's something I definitely have to knock her for here. So again, I think she is a still pretty strong player, but I have to put her here number 57. Number 56, one that I debate a bit with Tessa, where I think this player is very much on the same caliber.
Probably is a more flawed player. Yeah, I think also still has a lot of skills for game. At 56, I do have Logan from Brains for Brawn 2. And again, Logan is really this player here that was probably one of the best positioned players on the offseg, and her alongside Laura were part of the Coven, and along with that also had Max and Rich. And again, we're in a very strong position from the very beginning, only for, again, them to kind of overextend there, and Zara and Karin to eventually flip. And again, that's obviously not great at that point, to where she ends up being flipped on during the alley vote. And then following that gets a pretty unfortunate swap, though, despite that, ends up still remaining safe, despite, again, being there for, like, I guess, adversary and AJ, though she's able to, again, really build her bond with Karin, really build a bond with Kristen, where it does end up keeping her pretty safe throughout the rest of the pre-merge phase, despite, again, debates on taking her out. And once we get to her merge, I think she's able to, again, rebuild her game a bit, obviously get back with Laura and have control over those first few votes, only then obviously get flipped on again where she needs the idol, and then following that have agency during the Karin vote. The question is, should she have agency over the Karin vote? Or again, I don't think that was the right move for her, but she still did have that. And I think something that ends up really booning her is the fact that she does come very close to staying during her boot round, where obviously that was a spot where they almost went to rocks. And mind you, I don't know if they would have had the other 3 even know what rocks were, but still, it's definitely a spot there where I think she comes close to staying during a boot round, had 4 votes on her side, to where, again, I think that's decent enough there to where, again, I think it is close between her and Tessa. And I think there's definitely an argument that Logan is worse. I think there are definitely more nitpicks to be pointed out here with Logan. Though for me, it is the fact that I think Logan at least started off better than Tessa. That gives her the edge here. Where I think I would have more faith in Logan to make it deeper in most given seasons than Tessa. And again, it's a very minute difference, but I decided to go with that as the reason why she's here at number 56. Now, number 55. Back to a member of the Coven. We're moving to Karin from Brainsworth Brawn 2. And Karin is, again, kind of in the similar mold of like someone that I don't know if I necessarily agree with her strategic decisions in the game, but I do think she is a fairly competent all-around player. Now, someone that, again, probably able to hide how annoyed she is at points, and maybe that's not great, but I think on her season, again, played a fairly strong game. Obviously had the Covenant initially, was willing to flip against it once she realized that they weren't working for her benefit, puts together this new majority alliance that also is able to get their way when taking out Allie, and then gets swapped into a pretty good position where she's really this major pillar of that tribe, kind of playing the middle. Now, yeah, I still think her overall way she handles AJ is kind of misguided, or just like openly essentially telling him that she's annoyed at him is, again, not great, but and she really ends up being in this like very solid position for most of the game, not really talked about as a target. And it really isn't until like AJ flips the vote on her after the merge that she ends up being in any true danger, which again I think is fairly impressive for something like Australian Survivor, where it's kind of difficult to do that. Now, again, I think the thing about her, though, is that she obviously completely blows up her game on her way out, to where while I do think it would have been very unlikely that she ends up staying anyway, the fact that she really just goes scorched earth on her way out, it just felt like the wrong approach there. Even though, again, I still at least respect the fact that she's trying. But I think Karin's just a player that, again, is pretty well-rounded, played a pretty strong game of her season. Definitely flawed, definitely not a perfect player. Though, again, in comparison to the last few people we talked about, again, in comparison to Logan and Tessa, I think was better positioned throughout more of the game than them. Again, it's enough to put her one spot higher here at number 55. Now, number 54. We're moving on to, again, another fairly similar player. Going back to AE 2017, we do have Ziggy. And Ziggy's a difficult player here in the sense that she, in most aspects of the game, is a fairly well-rounded player, someone that is, again, good at challenges, someone that is very affable socially, and someone that plays the game aggressively, at least. I think the question is, should she be doing the things that she's doing? Or I don't necessarily agree with the decisions that she makes. The fact that she goes all in on working with the likes of Lockie and Henry towards the end of her game. The fact that she ends up using her Idol Nullifier on Elise. Like, that felt unnecessary as well. The fact that she really just flips against her original group coming into the merge felt so misguided. But at the same time, I do you think that at least shows some game ability there from Ziggy? The fact that she's willing to do those things. The fact that she's not just this player that sticks to her alliance and rides that to the end. The fact that she's willing to cut loose in the cases that she feels like it's necessary. Mind you, again, I debate if she should have done it to begin with. But again, I at least think it shows some game ability there that actually kind of propels her a bit. And again, in comparison to the likes of Tessa and the likes of Logan, I feel like she was more stably in the majority for more of the game. Where, again, both of them had spots in the pre-merge where they were in a rocky position. Ziggy was really in a pretty strong position really throughout all of it. Like, obviously she ends up being involved in the flip against Lockie, but before that, she wasn't even in that much danger. She seemed to be pretty well insulated in her tribe, and she's not really in danger until the post-merge phase of the game. So she obviously has a pretty rough last few rounds of her game, where while she obviously doesn't get voted out over the likes of Luke and Sarah, she's still someone that is a potential target there, and they just don't take the shot at her until a tad later, to where, again, Ziggy's a player, again, I do think it's a well-rounded player. I think the thing about her, though, is I just don't really agree with her strategic decisions, where if I did, I probably would have her a tad higher on this list. But I think she's a decent enough player all around, to where, again, she's here at number 54. Now, number 53. Now we're moving on to a tough player to rank here. The first player we're going to be talking about that ended up on Australian Survivor versus the World, and that player is Sarah Talik. And Sarah was very difficult for me because I do feel like Sarah is a player that has a lot of potential. But we've not really seen her live up to that potential up to this point, where, again, she seems like someone that is a fairly well-rounded player, pretty good socially, a very strategically active player. But obviously, again, I think it's in a spot where I don't agree with the strategic decisions she makes, where I think she was kind of on and off her first appearance, had some good points, had some bad points. Obviously, her 3-2-2-2 move was something that was just like unnecessary and causes the end of her game. Also, she was kind of sloppy in the mid portion of the game and has like open feud with Luke, which wasn't great. But really, for the most part, again, I think she came off as a fairly competent player her first time around. And we see her on AE vs. the World, where she tries to shake up her game, but ends up still kind of playing the same game, just doing kind of the half measure of kind of being too loyal to Kirby until it's too late, and also being this like kind of chaotic presence once again. And again, just kind of playing the same game to where obviously she ends up being the merge boot there. And it's really a spot where, like, for me, Eve vs. World did not change a single bit of my opinion on Sarah as a player. I feel like she kind of just ended up being the exact same player in a spot where I was disappointed by that. I was hoping that she would be a better player, but she wasn't. To where, ultimately, again, I think Sarah's actually a really tough player to rank here because I actually think there's an argument she's lower on this grouping of players. She is a player that kind of self-sabotages her games at points, and someone that I don't know if I necessarily have the most faith in her in the grand scheme of things, though I do think she's still a player that, again, is active enough and knows the game well enough to where, again, in comparison to people like Karin, people like Ziggy, I would still say that she's on their level to where, again, I think the fact that she, while having some blunders, still was able to recover from that, the fact that she was able to, like, repair her relationship with Luke and still, like, again, get to emerge in a pretty strong position, pull off the Henry move. Like, I still feel like she does some pretty strong things. And even with the 3-2-2-2 vote, it's still a spot where, like, that's an insane move to pull off, to where while I think it was the wrong move to pull off, still the levels of coordination to pull that plan off is still pretty impressive. So again, I think Sarah's, like, still in this tier. I think you debate on where exactly she lands, but for me, I did end up putting her at 53. Now 52, and now we're kind of moving on to some of these earlier merge boots that had a lot of potential that were kind of sniped out of the game, starting it off with Jesse from Blood vs. Water. And Jesse's this player here that, yeah, I think he was running a lot of the early game alongside Sam. They really controlled both of the tribes that they were on, which I think is fairly impressive. And even coming to the merge, they initially had that majority. But then we obviously have the likes of Mark and Josh flipping against Jordy. Jordy winning immunity, so they take the shot at Jesse. And a spot where Sam also proceeds to steal his idol. Where, again, all that is, like, pretty insane and a pretty disastrous downfall. But also, again, I think he gets a bit unlucky in the fact that I think he kind of gets dragged down the ship. He kind of gets dragged down because of Jordy. And also kind of gets dragged down by this all-men's alliance. Where I do think if it wasn't for the fact that this was a Blood vs. Water season, where you're incentivized to work with your loved ones, I do think him and Sam probably play a vastly different game. Probably play a game where they're more loyal to each other and probably, again, make this flip to save Khan early on. And again, I think this just would have been a vastly different season had this not been a Blood vs. Water season and something that Jesse could have excelled a bit more at. Yeah, again, in this season in particular, it feels like he was kind of dragged down by the format. Though, again, I do think he is a fairly well-rounded player. Again, he seemingly is, again, good in challenges, very likable, has a pretty decent strategic mind, where, again, I think Jesse has a lot of potential on most given seasons, but I think this one was one that just kind of disfavored him with how the game was set up. But again, I think he's a competent enough player here at number 52. Now, number 51, moving on to a player that also seemed like a very competent player that got voted out very early, though even this was a weird situation. And that player is Eden from Titans vs. Rebels. And I think Eden is someone that actually played a fairly strong game up until his elimination, was in the majority for most of the season. While there were points where, like, Mark was straying away, he essentially gets one up on Mark at almost every opportunity. There's not really a point until his elimination that Eden is, like, actively on the outs, to where, and we see him form the, like, Middle Age Mafia, lead the Frankie vote, at a swap scene with Caroline and Kitty really running that tribe and trying to keep the Middle Age Mafia together. And then we get to the merge where we once again takes out Winna. And then after that, almost reorganizes the Titans group together in a spot where they had so much friction within them to where it would have been very impressive if they actually did get back together. And again, we almost had Eden organize that. We literally had them get to a 6-6 tie. If it had not been for the last second flip in the votes, again, Eden probably would have been safe in that spot. And again, it's a spot where, like, Jaden really ends up flipping his vote unexpectedly there. For a while, I do think Eden probably still did have some issues long term. I think actually that was probably more a debate between Eden and Jesse, is the fact that I do think Jesse is someone that I actually probably think had more legs on that season, had things played out differently, where I feel like Eden is someone that I think either way was probably not poised to make it to the very end of the game. I think he definitely had a pretty big target on his back, where there were a lot of people talking about how big of a threat he was. Yeah, I do think he came off as a very strong player, played fairly optimally for most of his run, and pulled off some pretty impressive maneuvers by the end, to where while he gets sniped out by the end here, I do feel like, considering his placement, he plays a fairly strong game, and I think it's good enough to be here number 51. There we go. I mean, that is part 3 of my ranking of every Australian Survivor player. Obviously, again, part 4 will be coming out in the near future, where that will be the top 50 of the list, so we'll see how that plays out. But with that for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.